This is our newest installment of the Building Blocks of AI series. I am sitting down here with two experts in the industry, and we've got some pretty hot topics that we're hearing a lot about that we wanted to make sure we give some time on the stage to, and we can really flesh out. So, my name is Jacob Ortega with Lydonia Technologies. I'm a solutions engineer here. I'm joined here by Vinny LaRocca and Dan Liskowitz from Pienso. Gents, you mind introducing yourselves?
Sure. I would also like to have it. Expert is a loose term, right? Dan Leskowitz here. I head up sales and alliances for Pienso. Quick, elevator pitch. Pienso is a no-code, low-code AI platform. Specifically, it allows business people to use, interact with, and fine-tune large language models.
Very cool.
I'm Vinny LaRocca. I'm the director of engineering at Lydonia. Been working with AI now for roughly 10 years, originally focusing in application of AI to guide industrial robotics, and then moving more into computer science software land, and LLMs as transformers became more popular.
Well, this is a little bit of a departure from the machine world, but similar kind of themes here. It's kind of hard to think of a world without AI and Gen AI, especially in 2024. And I think something we hear a lot about is what is the differences, the benefits, and the overall usages of closed source versus open source models.
Yeah, maybe definitions first, because I think we probably have a spectrum of comfort.
That makes sense,
right?
Yeah, let's do that.
Open source models are exactly what they sound like. They're open. They're more openly accessible. Specifically the weights behind the model are known. We're able to use and manipulate them. Closed models, on the other hand, are more the proprietary models. So they tend to be provided by organizations like Cohere, OpenAI, a lot of the big names that dominate the space. But the way those organizations provide the model is they pre-train it, and then they stand it up against an API and allow users and customers to access that API. So you send your data to it, you get the inference result, the answer in response. You don't necessarily get to see the guts of the model, right?
Gotcha.
You ask a question, you get an answer.
Some major differences, right? And I think there's probably some trade-offs, maybe some benefits. Can we touch base on that real quick?
Yeah. So the trade-offs kind of come in a couple different flavors. I think one that frequently just kind of bubbles to the top is the question of privacy and security. So because of the nature of what I just described, where the closed source models, it's an API that exists somewhere, and you send your data to it. To use it, you literally have to send your data outside of your secure environment. Whatever your IT posture is, on-prem, Azure, GCP, AWS, choose your flavor. You're sending your data to some third-party API. For some organizations, honestly, that's perfectly fine, based on whatever data they're using. I would say for a lot of the customers, kind of at enterprise scale that we work with, they're very protective of their data. It is either comprised of maybe their customer information, including potentially PII, or there's another half of our business that is focused on the government, I think Department of Defense, intelligence community. That type of data is super sensitive. That literally cannot be sent external to whatever bunker it's being used on. So going to a third-party API is a non-starter.
Makes sense. Have we seen anything similarly?
Just regarding security in general. Yeah, I think people are hypersensitive of their data. They want to know where it's going, what it's being used for. And I think a key piece of this is to really understand what the goals of some of these companies are. So if you think about OpenAI, their mission is to create AGI, artificial general intelligence, and although that is an exercise in refining the architecture and making the model more efficient to bring costs down and things like that, really it is an exercise in mining data and training as much data into the model as possible, which I'm sure we'll cover more of this, but that a bunch of different problems come from that. But if you're talking to those models, you are donating your data to the model. And there are certain cases, like Dan said, where you might be fine with that. If I'm using it to help me write a blog post, I want it to refine grammar or something like that, great, that's fine. I don't really care that getting my data. But if I'm taking customer data and I'm putting it in there, there's some questions and some implications that arise there.
Yeah, I'd love to just double click on that. You raise a really good point. I think the concern around data leakage, right? Once you're interacting with the model, how much of that data is retained and how much of it is used for further fine tuning the model. Uh, Honestly, I think organizations have different perspectives on this. Some are either okay with a portion of that risk or are okay with using maybe a solution like OpenAI because it's sort of under the Microsoft umbrella and Microsoft is a vendor and all that sort of stuff. Uh, I think our perspective, what we recommend to customers is if you are really concerned about your data, you want to retain full control of it over it. And that means typically using an open source model that sits with your environment. And we're only 5 minutes into the discussion, so please don't take that as a I just solved it. Open or it's better. There's more to discuss, or we wouldn't have had these 30 minutes. But on the privacy and security side, that is one frequent consideration for our customers.
Yeah, and I think there's two sides to the coin when we're talking about security too. There's like data privacy, which people will coin as security, and then there's like actual cyber security of the model. I think those two things are different, and actually there's a dichotomy between the two. So open source model is going to be a great option for retaining that data privacy and making sure that there's no data leakage. From a cybersecurity perspective, there is additional things that you need to take into consideration if you're going to use an open source model.
We maybe double click into some of those things.
Yeah, so like a good example, and actually me and you were talking about this yesterday, is what's going on in Hugging Face right now is people are making like cloned repositories of popular models. So like Llama 3, just take that one as an example. If I'm a developer and I'm pinging a repository to pull that model in, there are similar repositories that have a very similar name, and it's really clear how a developer could kind of go wrong while building it. And that model comes in with malicious code in it that's used to embed itself and start to do things in your environment that it shouldn't. So there are tools now that will sort of fix that. Pienso fixes that problem. They're an example of sort of improving that version of the open source. But if you're just taking an open source off of a GitHub repo or Hugging Face, that is a concern and something you have to be careful of.
Yeah, it works for developer playing around your basement. Doesn't work at enterprise scale. Yeah,
makes sense. Seems like we're revolving around this theme of ownership and control, right? Configurability. In the realm of LLMs, what does that really mean?
Yeah, I'll take a shot, and then I know you've actually experienced this live, so I want your thoughts too. When we tend to talk about control, we're talking about control over the model itself. So let's take an example of GPT-4, which has been out for 16 months or something at this point, somewhere in that neighborhood. It would be totally reasonable to assume that GPT-4 is the same as GPT-4 has always been, right? Same name. In reality, that model behind that API, it changes. So every once in a while, every handful of weeks, every couple months, there are new checkpoints pushed. So basically sort of like micro updates to the model. Now, it's still GPT-4, sort of, right? And you and I at home just kind of asking ChatGPT for a recipe or trivia questions or whatever, we don't notice it because it's still probably correct, or it's correct enough for our purposes, or we can guide it. The problem comes from the fact that if GPT-4 is powering some sort of trend line on an executive dashboard, maybe it's like customer sentiment or what customers are calling about in a contact center, something like that, and everything's humming along just fine, and then we come in on Monday morning and there's a giant spike or a giant dip, well, in our experience, that is frequently due to the fact that a checkpoint was pushed, and there was no means of knowing that the checkpoint was coming or catching that it came. And so someone's getting an email about that dashboard, right? Why did we have this big change in performance? And so what we've done with some customers is ask them, as we kind of deploy Pienso, in parallel, use one of those APIs, right? And see how reliable it is over time. And what they found is that lack of control, that shifting checkpoint, it basically made the inference results unreliable over a long period of time. And I think it's just that most organizations right now are really working their way through POC, right? Yeah. They have not gotten to production scale, and it's only when you get to production scale and kind of that longitudinal time frame that you start to realize things shift over time.
Sense.
Yeah, so we had a customer who had built a large amount of automation off of ChatGPT, and they came in one week and they must have pushed a micro update, and I forget which model this was for, but it was one of the models that GPT was running on, and basically the model started responding in a combination of English and Spanish. Which is just it's an example of that kind of micro update, and that got corrected. But the problem with the automation is like that kind of stuff starts happening. You don't have any recourse.
Yeah.
So you're now you may have automated this process and it's been running fine for a year. Well, now you're down for a week. I can't do any break fix because I don't control the model. Well, now what do? You got to pull it back to a manual process, but nobody in your organization knows how to do it anymore. So especially when we're talking about automation, static is always better. The more static an environment can be, the more stable the automation will be in the long term. And sometimes we'll get customers who, I think it's like worth explaining how that occurs. So like when you're fine tuning a model, it's basically like this big 3D like scatter plot, and there's all these words all over the place, right? And you have, so I think really simple examples. If I had like dog and fire hydrant, like those words are going to be totally unrelated. Right? They have nothing to do with each other. But if I prompt the model or I'm doing fine tuning of the model and I start to teach it that my dog is actually named fire hydrant, right? Well, those two things now look like this on the scatter plot. So when you have these closed source models that are just pushing micro updates all the time, that scatter plot is changing, and it's not changing necessarily super significantly, not enough where if I was just talking to it, I would necessarily notice a difference, because it's still the same model and still the same architecture, still understands for the most part the same data, but again, especially when you're dealing with automation or something that, and when I say automation, I'm just referring to something that I'm not necessarily interacting with day to day. It's kind of just running, or it's doing something in the background. If they push one of those micro updates, those prompts now are not producing the result they once were. I got to go back in and re-engineer all of that, and that's a problem.
That's got to be an enormous lift.
Yeah, you can't do that at scale, right? So again, there's a place for both, right? If I'm just talking to the model and I'm chatting with it, and I'm not going to notice little fine, details of differences in what it's responding to me, that's fine. Then I don't have to worry about it.
I got to double down on one of the points that you said, just kind of describing the problem. And part of it comes from, you don't necessarily know there's going to be a problem. I had a boss at one point, and one of his favorite sayings was, problems aren't problems, surprises are problems. So the real issue is you don't know if the checkpoint's coming, and you don't have a way to kind of identify it in real time. So back to my sort of like Switzerland perspective of open and closed are both great. There are ways to use closed source models responsibly. One suggestion is implementing some sort of what I'll call evaluation, making sure that the prompt that you built yesterday is still functioning the way it is today, rather than just blindly accepting the output of the automation that Vinny's describing.
Yeah, and again, you have to just understand what the purpose of or the goal of OpenAI is. They're not looking to make an automation tool. They're not looking to create something that's going to be static. They want to create AGI, so they're going to continue to train more and more data into it.
It's a powerful point. It really does make sense. I think that's actually another good segue to another topic here. I know we're covering a lot of topics here. Folks, for you at home, if you have any questions, please feel free to throw them in the chat. We will get to them at the end of our session today. But I think jumping back to that segue, right? We're talking AGI, we're talking kind of the next generation, right? AI, Gen AI in the last 12, 16 months has really hit the ground running. But as you guys are looking at this, it's not right now in the next couple months. It's the long-term perspective, and how do we start to build what we need to get there. So it really does start to bring up this question of, when we're looking at closed source and open source, is there something that is, quote unquote, more intelligent or more powerful, or something that's going to fit that, that mark long term?
I want to touch a couple things there. So, there was some benchmarking that was done recently, and what was determined is that the open source models are always 6 months behind the closed source. Now, that may or may not seem significant to certain people, but the reality is it's really not all that significant, especially with some of the trade-offs. The benefit of closed source at this point really isn't that it's better. It's just that it's easy. It's right there. I can log in. I can start talking to it. I don't necessarily need to do a whole fine-tuned, close, open source model. If I'm just looking for the correct grammar and have a conversation with it, maybe make some LinkedIn posts for me, and not to trivialize the usage of that, but that's something where the advantages of closed source aren't open source. Sorry, aren't quite significant enough to warrant that level of effort into actually standing it up. I think the other thing people need to keep in mind too is that there are very literally different types of transformer neural networks that are built.
Yeah.
So the advent of sort of large language models, which is really a subset of machine learning. Um, when you started hearing about ChatGPT and all this, it was really transformer neural networks becoming, more powerful enough to start to do significant tasks, whereas in the past we were using, recursive type of network. And there are different types of transformers. So there's encoder based, there's decoder based. So like there's hybrid. There's a whole bunch of different types, but if you were to just take like decoder based, basically, if you were to just simplify it, it essentially means that it's very good at responding and putting together the response to prompts. Whereas like an encoder base is going to be really good at understanding and analyzing like large amounts of data and really getting a sense for what you're asking and a bunch of context around what you're asking as well. ChatGPT is a decoder based model. So part of the issue arises with like if I wanted it to create a LinkedIn post, well, that's a great use of a decoder model. I don't necessarily have to give it a bunch of context to have it do that. But one of the hallucination issues with ChatGPT is in part because it's built on a framework that very literally does a better job of responding than it does understanding. So it can misunderstand what you said, and then it can hallucinate and make the answer sound like it's a genius, and you go, oh well, that sounds very intelligent, so I'm going to believe it. And people just need to be aware that that's happening.
Makes sense. That absolutely does make sense. Yeah. Any other thoughts on the next generation? Right.
Yeah. I mean, I think part of the kind of question behind the question is like, what is smartest, right? And I hesitate to use that term because I don't want to anthropomorphize models, but that's kind of what we're asking, right?
Yeah.
And that changes with time. I really like the point about kind of the 6-month lag. I think that's valid. If you look back a year, closed source were the frontier models, and they were way ahead. Probably still technically, the frontier models, but with like Llama 3.1, 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, that gap is drastically narrowing. Our perspective going back years was that gap at some point will close and maybe leapfrog, right? Like it'll depend on the model and the vendor and everything. And so we have made the bet on open source models to a large degree, anticipating that. The other thing that I'll add to Vinny's analysis of like different types of models, I would also add that ideally, we're not just looking at one model as like, this is the smartest model in the world and I'm going to do everything with it. If we can approach it more as sort of like best of breed solutions, so there might be a model that is like really good for, I don't know, processing invoices. That doesn't need to be the model that you also use to analyze customer sentiment in like a contact center. It probably shouldn't be. The ChatGPT type models, GPT-4, even Llama 3.1, they're really good for those sort of like agentic experiences where you're having almost a conversation, right? And you've got to drill deep. You want a thought partner. I really like using ChatGPT for some things, like writing marketing emails. I also use it to look up like braised short rib recipes. Between the hours of 9 to 5, though, I probably shouldn't be caring about that. I care about something that understands my business data. And so from a performance perspective, an accuracy perspective, you'll sometimes go farther with a lot smaller model rather than the biggest, baddest one out there.
Yeah, and you guys you're solving for this in a really interesting way. You're sort of future-proofing yourself around these open source models because it's not really, open source, closed source. You can make this one-to-one comparison and say like, well, there's a 6-month lag. But when you look at what Pienso is doing, they're taking a bunch of small specialized models for individual tasks that you need within whatever thing you're trying to do. So they may have like an embedder or an encoding model that's going to understand some vector database, and that's going to pass information to some other type of model that's going to respond here. And then we have another model that might be producing some sort of competence threshold, and it becomes this sort of symphony of these small specialized models doing very specific tasks, which makes the comparison unfair because I'm not comparing one model to one model. I'm comparing 10 to one, and 10 is it's gonna be better because again I'm more specialized in what I'm doing. Um, I think you're sort of future proofing what the analysis is going to look like, because if that the one to one open source closed source does flip and open source starts to become better, well now we're taking closed source, which is already worse, and we're comparing 10 to 1, and now it's like really unfair.
That makes sense. Makes sense. We might see that bridge as more organizations start to adopt more mature, deployments and establishment of AI, right? So I think only the future will really be able to tell. But I know something that's on the top of everyone's minds and might be one of the leading deciding factors of whether open source or closed source is really how to understand budgeting and payment, and really just the dollar question, I think, has yet to really be answered yet at true scale and production. So how should people be thinking about that or approach that as they're getting started?
Yeah. So it is always going to depend. My typical caveat anytime we're talking to a customer is, and they have a budget question, is it depends. Depends on the use case. It depends on the type of data. How clean is it to begin with? Like what sort of things?
True.
How many times we're
Yeah.
calling the model? That sort of stuff. The main difference from a cost perspective between open and closed, though, is if you're using a closed source model, you are paying based on some measure of volume. If you're doing it directly with the LLM vendor, it's typically per token. If you're using that model via some abstracted like software layer, some other vendor, it's maybe abstracted to like per word or per document or page or something along those lines. So that pricing model tends to look really appetizing at the get-go because we're talking like fractions of a penny to do XYZ.
Hmm.
The problem, to your point, though, is most organizations are really only tackling those sorts of things in POCs. Maybe it's like synthetic data, maybe it's like one little business unit. And so that linear pricing, if whatever amount of AI we're all doing today is going to hockey stick, if that linear pricing continues, AI becomes negative ROI, untenable, somewhere in that territory. So our perspective is let's stay away from volume-based pricing because that makes it really tough to justify not only doing AI, but experimenting with AI. Ideally, to get the best AI outcome, you're using a ton of data, you're having a bunch of people experiment, you're trying different prompts, and then you're doing it all again. And that's really tough to do with a closed source model where you're paying for all those things before you know what the outcome is going to be. Like you don't know necessarily whether that prompt is going to work.
Yeah,
but you have to try to experiment.
it's true.
Yeah, so I think the analysis traditionally with open source, closed source would sort of be, I have to pay more for the closed source because it's not my model. I got to pay per transaction. Or on the other hand, I can download this model. I can if I have a decent enough computer, I can just run it locally. And so from that perspective, it's like, oh well, this one's a no-brainer. But that thing requires very, very expensive and highly technical resources to be able to fine tune and manipulate and actually use properly. So that's like another sort of major problem of open source that Pienso is solving for by just putting a low code, or really no code manipulator on top of those models.
Yeah, it really is sort of like a, LLM orchestration in a box, right? It provides that kind of turnkey solution, which is part of when people are budgeting for using a closed source model, it is super tempting and it's sort of the easy button to, count the number of tokens in your average document, do the multiplication and say, all right, this is what this AI project is going to cost me. That doesn't account for all the stuff that Vinny just alluded to, though, right? If you are using just a closed source API, you've got to have some amount of data scientists, ML engineers to interact with that model. You've got to come to it, mostly if you're doing any sort of like fine tuning, you've got to come to it with some label data. That's a cost intensive process, or you've got to outsource it. And so all those things are kind of their project costs that don't really get encapsulated in that per token pricing. Our goal is to sort of offer a package that provides more of an end-to-end solution so that folks don't have to itemize like every little spend required to do AI.
Make it simple. Makes sense.
Yeah, and like me and you went through this exercise, right? Where we were trying to build a model that was going to mine transcripts, and we were trying to figure out, prior to Pienso, like how do we minimize this transcript because we can't send this whole thing because it's too much money. So like now you're doing unnatural things to try to bring the cost down. Whereas like with an open source model, it's just like, well, I want to give it as much as I possibly can to make sure that it arrives at the right answers. I want to give it all that context,
Give it everything.
and I'm not, sort of starting with half a deck.
Yeah, I think that actually is a good segue. I want to make sure we leave some time to answer some of the questions from some of the users here. I think that's actually a good segue because one of the questions that's being asked is, what level of knowledge do I need to be able to select these correct models for the symphony of models, right? And how do we, apply that to the use case? And so I think that question goes along what you're talking about, Vinny, where there's this orchestration effort that needs to kind of go into this, right? And I think people trying to understand what is the easiest way to do that.
Yeah, so I mean, I would say with Pienso, the real understanding that you need to have is the data itself that you're manipulating, and that's really the analysis that they did. When they started building the tool was, you can come to me and say, hey, I want you to build this model, and this is what it's going to do, and that's great, but I don't necessarily understand your world, right? I don't understand the document, I don't understand the data in it, and so I got to have somebody over my shoulder really telling me what to do as I'm doing it, and really, it's a similar analysis to most of these, other adjacent low-code, no-code tools like UiPath, where it's like, well, you understand the process, I don't. So if I can teach you to do it, you're going to get more bang for your buck by doing it that way. If you were going to do this as, you were going to grab something off a Hugging Face, yeah, you're going to need to be advanced in Python. You're going to have to know some serious data science, and it's probably not something you should be getting into unless you've, really done some intense programming work in the past.
Makes sense. Absolutely does.
Yeah, just on the Symphony, we've talked a lot about different models are good for different things, maybe classification versus data extraction versus summarization. And yes, absolutely. And then part of that Symphony is also sort of the checks and balances that we implement or that are implemented within the platform, right? Verifying the result of a given prompt or a given result. There are different models that are better at verification for different types of tasks. I don't necessarily suggest that an organization looking to start an AI, unit go through the effort of evaluating all of those potential models and trying to narrow it down. Like we've abstracted that for users so that they don't have to, if they present a given task they want to accomplish in Pienso, they don't have to decide which model is best for it. That's already decided by virtue of the platform and some of the flow engineering that we've done. So certain type of task, certain type of data, you will be guided to the appropriate model.
Makes sense. That's awesome. Absolutely awesome. And then the big one, the big question that I'm hearing about every single day, agentic process automation. How is this relevant? What does it mean? What are we hearing?
Yeah, so the agent stuff is really cool. I think that's sort of the next big evolution in sort of LLMs and where this is all going. I'm not aware or have seen any products that are really doing it well right now. There are some like adjacencies. There are some people that are calling it, agent automation. There's a couple different terms for it, but if you hear agent, that's a dead giveaway that we're kind of talking about the same thing. And it's not quite that. So there's going to be a similar conversation when we start getting close to AGI. Like there's no good definition of it. So there's going to be this big argument about somebody, somebody's going to say, I did it. And there's going to be other people who are like, no, that's not it. Right. It's like, well, there really is no definition.
Yeah.
But the general idea of is if you take it to its extreme, like what the end game of the agent stuff is, hey, I want you to, take this so-and-so document that I manipulate every day. I want you to change it like this. I want you to download this other thing. I want you to combine it into one document, put together a presentation, and I want you to email it out to this person, this person, this person, and it will just go do it. There's a lot of adoption issues with that kind of thing. So like now you're hooking it up to systems and you're letting it actually go do and execute things.
Yeah.
I think the stage before that probably looks something like the same architecture that like an Amazon Alexa runs off of, where you're talking to it, it has some NLP understanding. It says, okay, I understand what thing I want you to do. It drives it into a bucket, and that bucket has a code-based automation. So it's not just like I describe something, it builds the code to go do it and then goes and executes it. it's doing pre-planned things that I've said, I want you to do these things, and it won't execute outside of that. I think that's going to be the first wave of it, and I think from an adoption standpoint, that'll be really straightforward to get people on, because it's not that different than like what we're doing with automation today. Once you make that next leap into like true like API, letting it go through your systems, putting it on a server, allowing it access to a bunch of stuff like an employee, there's a lot of security concerns and there's a lot of adoption issues that we're going to run into.
That definitely makes sense. Stuff I think we're just starting to consider right now, right? So bring it all the way back to the top, right? Open source, closed source models, based on your guys' experience and opinions, which is the better approach?
So this is the part of the webinar where I offend either half, one half or the other half of the people on the phone. But I don't think I'll do that. I will say honestly that there's not a one size fits all answer for that. It depends on what you're doing. I personally, in my way of working within Pienso, I use both, but it depends on the task. We threw out some examples where a closed source ChatGPT type agentic interface is super appropriate. I definitely use that every day. For more, discriminative tasks, tasks that need to happen at scale with high precision for automation purposes or analytics purposes, those we tend to gravitate toward open source models. But it is very much a trade-off. I expect the space to continue to leapfrog as individual models improve. The last little bit I'll mention is your question earlier around agentic automation. I don't know if this is intentional, but nice little teaser of our next session, which is agentic interaction with LLMs versus directed manipulation. Beyond the scope of the last 30 seconds here, but tune in next time.
Next time.